way to teach the Tragedy of the Commons fishing lab. Backstory in the lab, I learned this my first year teaching apes from consultant Ben Smith, great consultant. I've modified the lab a lot. I'm going to explain to you how to do the lab and then how to actually take it beyond piles of candy in the classroom. This is a great way to get into a discussion on things such as distribution of global resources based on when a country went through demographic transition, which sounds very complicated, but it's a valuable lesson for the kids. Backstory about it, Garrett Hardin, just a jerk. Basically, a lot of his stuff he wrote about was to try to keep other countries from getting developed and overregulation. But this philosophy of tragedy of the commons does apply throughout environmental science. It's people overuse things when they can optimize their benefits, and everybody collectively shares in the losses. Here are relevant examples for schools and to your students and to the course on the right column. This is a great lab to do earlier in the year because it relates everywhere. That being said, I like to do it right after Halloween when the candy is the cheapest. It's a great lab for like that brain dead days they have right after Halloween. One of the things with the understanding of the tragedy of the commons is the solution proposed by Garrett Hardin was not privatization, which is something going on in a lot of federal discussions right now with our public lands. The word he used was coercion. The official word we use now, because it's less creepy, is regulation, but it's the same thing. We'll pay you to be good, and you'll get fines when you are naughty. Picture in the top is actually a young woman working in college on a commercial fishing vessel as a National Marine Fisheries Observer. It's one of the ways that we regulate the actual catching of fish in the U.S. waters. The goal for this lab is the students are going to work in their groups to regulate the shared resource of their ocean. There's the other shared resource you're going to see is the global supply of all of the fish represented by the jars of candy in the front of your classroom. Don't tell them this at the beginning. One of your goals is to enjoy watching them hunt for candy and watch every effort to be sustainable fall apart, and that those who were sustainable kind of got financially screwed in the end. Materials for the setup. Go over whatever candy you're allowed to have in your school based on food allergies. Get enough small Ziploc bags to take the extra candy home with them because you don't want them hopped up on that much sugar for their next class. Lots of paper plates because they're disposable. Any type of fishing device. And obviously clean lab tables. Safety issues, obviously food allergens. It's a big one. Don't have them use straws as sucking devices. Some of my early years, they did use the straw to try to suction it, and that was dumb on my part, so don't do that. Plus, it's gross, and they're going to drool and sneeze. This is one of the ways you're going to make the lab more fun for you and more educational and frustrating for the students. Give them the lab packets, and I'll include them in this with the file for this video. Go over the lab with them the day before. My procedure is completely hard to follow for that reason. Go over it with them the day before and explain when you come to class tomorrow, as soon as you're here and everyone in your ocean's here, you can start fishing. As you know, students, there are going to be those groups that are go-getters that get started right away. There are going to be some that are putzing around. They're not going to get it done right away. They're going to hesitate. There's going to be a bunch that overthink it. And you actually want that to happen. Let them know, like, you regulate your own fishing cycles. The setup for the day of the lab, get like 4 big jars, bowls, containers, and fill them with whatever candy you like. My go-to favorites are M&Ms, gummy bears, Swedish Fish, and Sour Patch Kids. After Easter, you can get really cheap jelly beans and really gross, cheap gumdrops as well, if you want to do it after Easter. They don't need to have equal abundance because we're going to play with the economics of the candy as well. One thing with the candy, each candy will have a different value, and you can decide. This is generally the ones that they like the most are going to have the most value, but strangely enough, the minute you say Swedish fish are the most valuable, they all like them more, even though gummy bears taste better. That's personal belief. That's not on the AP exam. So each lab group represents an ocean, and their ocean is represented by a paper plate in the middle of the table. If you've got lab groups of 8, you're going to need more candy to start that ocean. If you have lab groups of 4, you can use less. Like, just do the math. The key is have them put 2 or 3 of each type of fish on their plate so that there's enough for them to each consume at least 1 or 2, and for that population to repopulate. And each cycle, they must consume at least 1 fish. If they don't want to eat it, they just have to mark that it was consumed and put it in the Ziploc bag. The Ziploc bag is actually for them to abscond with all the candy afterwards. Each cycle, they must consume at least 1. You can decide, like, if you're going to regulate cheating or whatever. But here's one of the things: have them regulate their fishing cycles and all of this, because you'll see something amazing. One of the first things I did to screw with the students on this lab and make it more educational is to discuss privatization. Each person gets a smaller plate, and they can use that as a private fishery. Or you can call it aquaculture, whatever you want. And to do the private fishery, they just need to pull some fish from the ocean and then let them reproduce in their private pond each cycle. They could choose never to harvest them, whatever they want. This does actually represent, aquaculture, but also obviously represents privatization. And those fish can reproduce as well if they consume the fish from their private pond. Like, those count as fish consumed. That's totally fine. Obviously, any fish consumed cannot reproduce. One cool thing that only happened 2 times in my years teaching this class: twice I had kids ask if they could repopulate the oceans with their private fishery, which was so cool. Then I was like, wow, that's amazing. Then I didn't know how to handle it. So I was like, no, you've already touched the candy. It's gross. Keep it. So choose the length of the fishing cycle. They're going to tally on the data sheets the fish consumed. They don't count any fish in the private ponds till the end of the fishing cycles. Everything can reproduce in the ocean or in their private ponds by mitosis. And you'll have to say that about 4 dozen times to them. Like, if you have 1 gummy bear, it's going to become 2 gummy bears. I switched to that because I was getting tired of them having, like, what if we have a half gummy bear? And which was my nemesis on the APES exam too. And let them manage their fishing cycles. As they're managing the fishing cycle, watch your jars of candy in the front of the room. And yes, those are 4 beakers. They never contain chemicals. I had those only for this lab. And as the candy supplies get low, start fluctuating the values to mess with them more, because it's good. One of the things when we have scarce supplies of something, the value goes up and protecting it becomes harder. And you could give examples of things like elephants or Patagonia toothfish called, what's the name? Sea bass. The lab ends when the candy supply is over, or the lab ends when the candy supply is gone. And then give them some while to calculate the candy for each person. Brace yourself, because they'll be munching on a lot of sugar. And as this is going on, start just making a humorous commentary about how some groups have a ton of candy and the ones that started later didn't have as much. The other take things for them to grasp. All it took is 1 person to screw up any aspect of sustainability within their group. Private ponds led to more overfishing in most cases, unless somebody said, can we restock the oceans? And then the final thing is on demographic transition and developed countries. And this is something to wind down the lab discussing. It's depending on the state you are in the United States, this is something that you might want to make sure you talk about in ways that don't get you in trouble. I'm in Costa Rica and there's no extradition, so I can say what I want. Not really, but. So this is a map of developed countries taken from one of the textbooks. And actually this was from Wikimedia Commons, but it came from a textbook originally. And We're going to talk about this a lot because if you haven't, well, you can see there seems to be some bias on what they consider developed, and it's funky. Officially, what's considered developed are these things. And by the way, I live in Costa Rica right here, and I was working on this lesson a few years ago, and one of my Costa Rican friends was there and had me happen to look at this map, and he taught me a lot of Spanish with a lot of anger, pointing out that Costa Rica actually is developed, has been developed for a while, and was one of the fastest countries to go through demographic transition in world history. And he's like, you guys just don't think we're developed because we speak Spanish. And then he pointed out some other things, which we'll get to. Here's one of the things. Countries with developed officially have more money, those things. Developing countries are still working towards that. Some of the challenges I've learned since moving here, countries that are Caucasian are more likely to be classified as developed. Countries with militaries are as well. Some parts of the country may be more developed than others. Where I grew up in rural northern Wisconsin, there was not much access to healthcare. Everybody was on private wells. They are still waiting on high-speed internet. By comparison, where I live now, we have high-speed internet, universal healthcare. 98% of our power is carbon neutral from green sources. And unlike where my parents still live in northern Wisconsin, we don't lose power here for 2 or 3 weeks at a time after a storm. Some language to make sure the kids don't use, it won't affect their grade on the exam, but it just makes them sound like bad people. Stop calling countries undeveloped or third world, please, or poor countries, or those people. By the way, that's a picture of the big shopping mall on the edge of San Jose in Costa Rica. What's better to talk about with them is this concept of demographic transition. And we're going to get to this, and we're going to bring it back to the Commons Fishing Lab. The first stage of demographic transition, birth and death rates are high. Actually, we'll go through it this way. So this is the journey. And some textbooks have 4, some textbooks have 5. I know some of the review websites from people are asking to identify what stage a country is in. The AP exam will never ask you to guess what stage any country's in because it's usually a little bit prejudiced for what we decide. So the first stage is high death rates, high birth rates. They cancel each other out. So the entire population stays low. This would be the US in about the 1890s. Stage 2, population increase begins because first thing we have is the death rates go down from access to healthcare infrastructure and antibiotics and vaccines. The birth rates usually don't go down for a generation or 2 because of what we'll just call cultural inertia or cultural momentum. This was the US through, well, depending on what part of the US, pushing through like the 1940s. In rural parts of the US, this lasted longer. Stage 3, the population increase continues. Birth rates fall down finally. Death rates continue to decline, but the population continues to grow. Stage 4 is birth rates and death rates are low. And then stage 5, it can start declining naturally, which is happening in parts of the US and Europe, where it's things like it's just too expensive to have a kid, don't really need a kid, and things of that nature. Now, on the APES exam, they usually say stages 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. The high stationary, early expanding, late expanding, low stationary, declining. That terminology is in a few textbooks and like the People's Population Education Group or whatever. They don't need to know. Like human geography, I think, has 5 stages, and I think we have 4 stages. Just let them know about the 5th stage because they might be taking human geography as well. So, by the way, the solution is stage 5, and in parts of the U.S. this is happening now. There becomes things like a labor shortage, and a labor shortage is very problematic, not just for the tax base, but because the entire region can't function. Things like there's a shortage of people to work in certain jobs. And this is now happening in Vilas County, Wisconsin, where I grew up. Important thing to note is stages 2 and 3 have rapid population growth, and that can be reduced by access to education and professional opportunities for women. What Costa Rica did when they became independent in their latest kind of revolution, like I think the 1940s, they abolished their military and realized they could fund education and provide infrastructure and healthcare, or they could have a military. Costa Rica had a bad history with military occupation and realized they didn't want any more military here, but they'd also really hadn't pissed off any other countries, so they don't have a military. This access to education meant birth sizes since about the 1960s. The birth rates for women have plummeted, not because there's any regulation, not because there's, abortion is not legal in Costa Rica. Access to birth control is legal in Costa Rica, and it's even advertised on billboards on highways and covered in their universal health care plan. But this access to education to women, men, and everyone else, these kinds of things kind of change the futures for people. They often realize their sustainability or their ability to take care of themselves in later years. They don't need to have as many children as my great-grandparents did, because then the death rates were so high, they needed to have 9, hoping 2 would make it to adulthood to take care of them. Say those things really carefully so it does not sound like a weighted judgment. With demographic transition, make sure the kids know they're not going to be asked to identify a country and their stage of demographic transition. The students need to understand most people in the world live in developed countries. And then, one more slide, or 2 more slides. And then we'll be done with the slides, and I'll go to a lame camera footage of me. Star Trek is wrong about one thing. This was their prime directive. Basically, I'm not going to read that whole thing. They won't share modern technology with any developing or with any world until that world develops the ability to drive at warp speed technology or whatever. So one of the things that with that is that actually doesn't help the rest of the world. And we're going to get to why Star Trek is wrong with this slide. Most of these areas that are orange and red had their resources taken in the past centuries by the areas that are blue. And by taken, so my friend Jose told me, and he was angry. And he's like, sweetie, people come to Costa Rica and they complain about the condition of our roads. It's kind of hard because, a bunch of people came and took all of everything valuable out of our country and financed the entire Renaissance in Europe and built their universities. It's like, we're doing really well considering a whole bunch of people took a whole bunch from us. And that's one of the things to understand from this is when we're talking about things like commons fishing and then turning it into a demographic transition and access to global resources, it's important to recognize that developed countries actually took a lot from these other places to create the countries that they now have. And the idea of sharing technologies with others is not charity. It is actually helping those other countries go through demographic transition. And in fact, by doing that, they can reduce birth rates faster without violating human rights by helping countries have access to education and, and things of that nature. And that can allow the world to become more developed without overusing resources through things like Kuznets curve, which is the idea that as countries become developed, they go through peak environmental degradation. So when you do this lab with the kids, think about ways to get this more relevant, bringing out demographic transition. It's an easy way to start doing the conversation And it's a really important lesson for them. I had degrees. I thought I knew a lot about this stuff, and I mean, I'd been a consultant for years before I moved here. And to hear of a Costa Rican rip me a new one, just saying, do you understand how much has been taken from a bunch of the world so the rest of you could become developed? And that's not fair for us. And it's true. And now the other thing to point out is places like those maps of which countries are developed are highly inaccurate. Costa Rica now has access to free college education, and the country is becoming more developed in many ways than, say, the United States. Like, I would comfortably say that Costa Rica is more developed than where I grew up in northern Wisconsin. Now, that's not saying all of Costa Rica. There are areas with less access to internet, but the infrastructure that you would see here is definitely not what you would consider a developed country. And point out these misconceptions. And honestly, when I heard from my friend, Europe financed their Renaissance by all the gold they took from the Americas and silver and everything else. And it never dawned on me that the dates of the conquistadors are pretty similar to the dates of the Renaissance and, everything in Europe. And then that had a ripple effect on the rest of the world. So bring out these things to the kids. Obviously, point this out, and then talk about some of the ways that we can help countries that are developing are sharing technologies. Not everybody needs to invent the cell phone. One thing that Costa Rica has done, and a lot of developing countries have done, a lot of them skipped coal-fired power plants as they became developed. They're like, we're just going to go right to the renewables because we don't even have much coal. They skipped land phone lines, which saved a lot of resources because they're like, why don't we just put in cell phones right away? They put in fiber optic in a lot of the country all at once because they're like, why would we put in the cheaper, slower stuff? Let's just put in the good stuff right away. And by sharing these technologies with other countries, it's great. And also, it's important for the entire world. Not everything has been invented in developed countries. Another lesson from Costa Ricans, antibiotics were invented in Costa Rica in the 19th century. The guy's name was Clodomir Picado, maybe in the early 19th century. He actually was doing the studies showing that bacteria inhibited fungal growth. And he didn't really discover it. He was working with ethnobotany with some of the tribes in Costa Rica and found out they were using certain fungi to kill bacterial infections. And then Fleming saw his field notes, recreated it, and took credit for it. Clodomir Picado also is the person who figured out how to produce antivenom. So he's a famous biologist from Costa Rica. So the world has antivenom and antibiotics from a country that was, at the time, still not developed and actually occupied territories with, fruit plantations and very dubious human rights. But there still were great discoveries here. But I've rambled on enough.